Well, we're back again. Last time a lot happened that essentially threw Rosemine into the deep end of this country's struggles. She accidentally stumbled onto the path to the Book of Mestianora, was coerced by the royal family into an adoption and marriage, and in the background of all that, we're finding out that Georgine, Raublut, and Lanzanov are all connected in a way that's pointing to a bad outcome for Ehrenfest. So what's gonna come out of all this? Well, we're not gonna find out until much later, because now that the Archduke Conference is over, Rosemine has to head home and deal with the fallout of her impending adoption into the royal family. Her marriage to Wilfried, her retainer's choices, and getting her lower city family prepared become the focus of this volume. But before we go ahead and get into all that, why not hit the subscribe button? It's a great way to stay up to date on Bookworm content from me. I'm sure there's an animation playing around there somewhere. I've also got some merch for sale, so check that out if you want to show your love for Bookworm. And with those obligatory plugs out of the way, let's go ahead and get into Part 5, Volume 6. Our prologue begins from Florencia's perspective, right after the Archduke Conference ends. She meets with Sylvester in his chambers, and they discuss what went down and their plans moving forward. Aside from the mind-bending absurdity that happened, the implications back home are only going to cause more political unrest when they're struggling to get a grip on their internals as is. Mostly because Wilfried and Rosemine's engagement ending leads to a new political vacuum and struggle for the next Aub. But how is Wilfried gonna react? Well, it's complicated. We find out here he's been begging his parents to end their engagement anyway, and Sylvester's continuously shot him down. That seems pretty antithetical to his desire to be the next Archduke, but the whole situation gets elaborated on later, so just wait. Aside from him, Charlotte's had to beat back her own desires to be Archduchess, and forced to support Wilfried. How is she gonna react now that she can actually go for the job? Then there's Melchior, who was already being raised for a support role, and to be the next High Bishop. What the hell's he gonna do? So essentially, this puts everyone's future up in the air back home. And the thing is, this doesn't make Wilfried's position stable in the slightest. He's still a former criminal propped up by his engagement. With that over, he'll be faced with assassination attempts and growing cries for him to be disowned or sent to the ivory tower with Veronica. And after they finally removed Oswald from Wilfried's service too, assuming he was the root cause. We do find out what actually took them so long to do so, and this was actually meant to be a learning experience for Wilfried, giving him hints that Oswald wasn't working in his interests. However, the kid is so trusting and didn't want to turn his back on the retainers who stayed by his side when they could have left him after the ivory tower incident. And the problem is, Bartold is keeping a line of communication open between Oswald and Wilfried, suggesting Wilfried doesn't actually see the issue here. You know, why he was dismissed in the first place. Yeah, there's a ton of education that needs to take place, and this only reinforces that early education has a bigger impact than they thought, especially if their son is struggling with basic issues like this after so many years outside of Veronica's influence. Once they get what little alone time they'll get as nobles, Sylvester and Florencia recap the events of the conference, and they're realizing just how much of a burden the winning duchies are bearing, and what it actually means to be treated as one. From a normal noble perspective, the losing duchies were broken up and assigned to greater duchies to manage. While Druanchel was too far away to actually do that, they're instead supporting the sovereignty by sending nobles in droves to fill positions. The middle and lesser duchies are pretty much doing the same since they can't really manage the fallen duchies, and we get a nasty bit of foreshadowing that the part of old workstock under Arensbach management is so bad, it's completely devoid of mana in places. So getting the Gurchasite would fix a lot of the country's problems, thus Ehrenfest is duty-bound to provide it, if they can. Florencia's pride is a bit hurt, that this should be a great honor, but they're not able to send Rosemine off with a smile, and hardly any retainers to support her. What little benefit they got from these negotiations was purely due to how strange Rosemine's upbringing was. Her leaving Ehrenfest is gonna hurt a ton because they still haven't even recovered after Ferdinand, but at least they do have some time to prepare. But based on everything that's happened, Florencia views Rosemine as too narrow-minded to be a royal, because she's more invested in Ehrenfest than the rest of the country. But Sylvester's not entirely in agreement. There's times Rosemine is too sharp for her own good, and capitalizes on the briefest of windows, so maybe they could focus on getting her to care about the royals and sovereignty over the next year too. That would help. It's been going great with Wilfried, right? Not that they're gonna have time to actually educate her to be a royal or even a presentable noblewoman with their workload and Rosemine's lack of interest. Which really means they need to focus on a plan of action, and that's basically going to be business as usual. With one minor tweak, Wilfried might not be the next Archduke, but Sylvester still plans to make him work as though he is. That way he can still support him in paperwork and stuff. The Lies gangs are going to kick up a fuss, but this is beyond them to protest, and they got ample compensation in return for Rosemine's adoption. Things are scary, but they'll handle it back home. Or so they hope. But there is a difference in perspective from Florencia and Sylvester. Whereas the daughter of a third wife, Florencia's position as an Archduke candidate was always up in the air. Sylvester was the only son of a first and only wife for that matter, so he never really had to fight for his position, let alone status. But to keep things from spiraling out of control, they're going to keep this adoption a secret until Rosamine is basically out the door, leaving the bulk of preparations to Elvira because Florencia's condition and the lack of manpower in the archducal family. We spent a lot of time focusing on how Rosamine's going to move and what the sovereignty needed to get in order, that the implications were just left out there that Wilfrid's going to lose his guaranteed position as the next Aub. And that's true, but as we're seeing, it's not the whole picture. Rosamine's move won't just leave a manpower shortage, but also a power vacuum, as Wilfrid loses his position, and possibly his status in the family. That means Brunhilde is going to be the next hope for the Lies gangs, and that puts Florencia in a pretty precarious spot. All while Charlotte and Melchior try to figure out who's going to be the next Archduke, because there's no way in hell people are going to accept Wilfrid without Rosamine in a package deal. And that's what we're going into this volume. Back to Rosamine's perspective as she just returns from the conference. She's barely off the magic circle when Sylvester announces there's going to be a meeting tomorrow. The usual post-conference discussion, but she knows there's going to be a bigger talk besides that. On the way back to the northern building, Bonifatius escorts them as Rosamine tells her siblings about her first Archduke conference. Just the regular details about the ceremony she performed in her transcribing. On the other end, Melchior memorized prayers with Charlotte and Wilfrid, while he can also now do mana replenishment without collapsing, so he's grown somewhat. In her room, she switches retainers so her adults can rest while her apprentices take over. Though Lieseletta stays on because otherwise Gresha would struggle. And I mean, I guess she barely did anything at the conference, since Otilli was with Rosamine every day in the archive. And while she gets reports about the temple and crap is put away, she realizes she'll have to schedule a meeting after the big family one with her retainers, so Brunhilde will need to be called back too. When it's time for said meeting, a ton of higher-ups are gathered and Melchior is attending as well, despite him not really knowing why. Rosamine does, but she can't say just yet. That's when Sylvester kicks into the usual post-conference wrap-up by relaying all the decisions made. Anastasius made good on his promise and Ehrenfest is being treated as a winning duchy, but the price for that is pretty steep. They have a duty to fulfill that Sylvester will announce next year, but the rewards for it are pretty substantial. They're getting 40 magic tools for children, and no one can marry out of Ehrenfest for the next 5 years. Everyone else is going to have to marry in, which is a pretty smart play on Sylvester's part to make Rosamine's adoption seem like Ehrenfest's burden to bear is being accepted as a winning duchy. But that is definitely a lot to get, so the nobles gathered are worried about what's in store. What could demand such a big reward? From there, he blows past that topic onto Ferdinand's engagement being delayed, the yearly dedication ritual at the conference starting, meaning more divine protections, the royal family now officially being Zent candidates aside from Det Lind, and Stab acquisition is being moved back to the third year, while also the addition of the Royal Academy dedication ritual. That brings up the new rush on picture Bibles they're bound to see this summer, but the stock probably won't be as plentiful as they hope. Printing's pretty much done for the season, since it's usually done as winter handiwork, but next year when Groschel opens up, they'll have plenty available with the added trade slots. Sylvester then officially announces that Aub Arensbach has passed, so the funeral will be held at the end of summer. He has to attend obviously, without Florencia because of her pregnancy, and this is why Ferdinand Starbind was delayed. The king refused the Lanzenau princess, the Trug-Haddled knights were expelled from the Sovereign Knights Order, and interest in religious ceremonies is on the rise. Stuff we either knew already, or expected to happen. And that brings the public meeting to a close, as Sylvester clears the room of everyone except the archducal family, even retainers. That news shocks everyone there because this has never happened, but an order is an order. So clearing the room is something we've become accustomed to in this series, but it's meant to be a pretty rare occurrence. Even more so for private meetings, because people need to be there to witness what occurred. Hell, the prologue even shows that Sylvester and Florencia's private time is just their retainers standing behind screens while they have to use sound-blocking magic tools. So after this big meeting where Sylvester announces a mysterious burden, he then calls for the room to be cleared? That makes everyone stressed, even those attending. So they activate a sound-blocking magic tool on top of this. Bonifatius is the first one to ask what's up with all the secrecy, and the news comes out with zero ceremony. Rosemine's gonna be adopted by the king and engaged to Sigiswald after next year's Archduke conference. Sylvester goes on to explain they were given a year to prepare, and as such, they're not going to announce this adoption because it will put a few people at risk, so they need to make it look like nothing has changed while scrambling to hand over all of Rosemine's work. Bonifatius is in an uproar because she's an Archduke candidate, she can't be moved to the sovereignty, right? Well, she's adopted. All Sylvester has to do is cancel her adoption, and she'll be an archnoble able to be adopted by the king. Wait, did he seriously go along with that? Yeah, because he had to. He explains everything they got in exchange for Rosemine, but Bonifatius isn't happy, especially over Ferdinand's safety. Bonifatius is flat out pissed he sold her for his brother's sake, despite him not being in Ehrenfest anymore. But Sylvester directs his complaints to Rosemine, since she was the one who requested it. What the hell, did she fall in love with him or what? Again, familial love, it's not like that. Keep telling yourself that. So is Rosemine happy about this arrangement? No. She's leaving the city and people she loves. Also her library. But she doesn't have a choice as it's by royal decree. Bonifatius should be pretty proud. His granddaughter is gonna be a princess and married to a future king. He's even said in the past that Wilfried isn't a good match for her, and Wilfried takes that with some self-awareness. He's heard countless times that she's better suited to be the next Aub over him. And yeah, he's keeping his torrent of emotions in check, but there's clearly something he wants to say. Understand, he was the one meant to keep Rosemine in Ehrenfest, and despite him asking to cancel their engagement, he was just told to endure. So what's this mean? Who's gonna be the next Archduke, since Rosemine was Wilfried's path towards it? And the answer is, Sylvester doesn't know. This just means that the race is on, be it Charlotte, Melchior, or Florencia's new kid. Or you know, should Wilfried actually manage to redeem himself, he could still pursue the role if he wants. Wait, Charlotte could actually become Aub? She's barely holding back tears at that, and Florencia confirms it for her. Now this has been mostly absent from the main story, but Charlotte had a pretty solid upbringing to be the next Archduchess under Florencia. But when Wilfried was just given the spot, she lost all hope. Now that struggle comes up in the short stories collection more so than the mainline books, but we've still heard a fair amount about her pain. But for Rosemine, she's suddenly realizing just how badly she betrayed Charlotte all the way back in part 4, by accepting this engagement to Wilfried despite saying she would support her little sister. Florencia makes sure Melchior understands that he has an equal claim to the role too, should he try for it, but he's still trying to get a grasp on just being the High Bishop. He doesn't really have time for that. Well, good thing she's gonna leave some people behind to help support Melchior in his new role. But that basically brings them all up to speed, and Sylvester dismisses Bonifatius, Charlotte, and Melchior because there's still some air that needs to be cleared between Rosemine and Wilfried. This has been on the back burner boiling since volume 3, but we're finally getting the full issue here. So what's Wilfried's problem? It's honestly a bit unexpected considering the complaints we've been hearing thus far. So Sylvester tells him to speak his mind, and we finally get what's up. Wilfried has always struck us as a pretty optimistic but confident guy. But after this last winter, what really stuck in his head from Ortwind and the Lysgangs was his own inadequacy. He's the only Archduke candidate who was raised by Veronica and committed a crime himself. By all rights, he should have been punished in the Purge too. Sylvester flat out told him he was the least suitable person for the job of Archduke. And without Rosemine, he wouldn't have even been able to stay an Archduke candidate, let alone take the seat. So the kid wants to know, what's gonna happen to him now that it's come to pass anyway? And again, Sylvester just honestly doesn't know. Rosemine's lost here, but he goes on to explain it. The Purge got rid of Wilfried's support base, and if she's not his fiancée, he can easily be pushed into the Ivory Tower by the Lysgangs. Now this all does depend on how much they can curb the Lysgangs' power over the next year. It is pretty stupid that the Lysgangs want to get rid of a capable Archduke candidate like Wilfried, especially with their mana and manpower shortage. But while Rosemine thinks that, Wilfried wants to know why she feels so detached from this situation. The Lysgangs are her faction, right? She's supposed to be the one to contain them as their princess. But Sylvester speaks up in her defense, saying she's basically a stranger to them and doesn't view them as family. She was raised in the temple and never socialized with them. The job of containing them falls to Elvira and soon to be Brunhilde. The insults the Lysgangs hit Wilfried with over Spring Prayer really struck him in his core. But not like the actual insults, it's more the revelation that a good chunk of the population doesn't actually like him. There's also this whole betrayal aspect, where his father and mother put him on this path when no one really wanted him to be Aub. He's been mocked and abused while constantly living in Rosemine's shadow. So at this point, his entire life feels like a cruel joke. He explains that he would rather die than spend his entire life as her fiancé or husband, constantly being compared by her to Ferdinand. That's why he never used her charms or tried to make anything for her in turn, because he knew whatever he tried to just wouldn't be good enough. But the cherry on top of all of that is that he knew that she would never care about him like she does Ferdinand, so there was never really any point in trying. Wilfried was trying to end his engagement and just make Rosamund the Aub in the first place. That way he would finally know peace. Yeah, she wasn't told about this, but it's pretty obvious why. She didn't want to be engaged to him either, and they would have conspired together to end it. But since Sylvester was refusing to make her Archduchess, she just would have gotten poached by the royals or a top-ranking duchy. And that's why their retainers are working to keep them apart. But since they're airing things out, Sylvester tells Wilfried his timing was just plain bad. Had he have done this before Ferdinand was ordered to leave, he would have just switched Ferdinand to her engagement partner and called it there. But then he decided to wait and throw this fit until after the purge. By then it was too late. And I mean, this still isn't a happy ending for Wilfried. Rosamund's gonna be a royal while he's losing any security he had as an Archduke candidate in Ehrenfest, while having to pretend over the next year that his life isn't falling apart. He slams his fist down and yells that his father could have avoided all of this by making Rosamund the next Aub Ehrenfest. Yeah, dude's expecting to either be sent to the Ivory Tower, killed, or demoted, so he needs to hear what's gonna happen from his father's mouth, just so he can prepare himself. So what insight does Sylvester offer? He tells him to live as he pleases. If Wilfried's not going to be the next Aub, it's no longer his job to contain the Lies gangs. All he has to do is balance his duties as an archducal family member. He can take the knight's course if he wants, become the knight's commander, be a Geeb, or just support the duchy like Bonifacius does. Hell, if he really wants to, he can wait 5 years and just marry out of Ehrenfest into another duchy. But here's the kicker. If he does actually want to be Aub, Rosamund won't be in the race anymore for him to be compared to, so it would actually feel like a fair fight for him. He has a year to make up his mind, and for the first time in his life, the future is his to decide. So Rosamund and Wilfried come to a sort of truce. Their engagement is over and they both hated it in the first place. But for the next year, they can just go back to being siblings, which worked out for them. Well, that's an emotional spiral that didn't go how most expected. Wilfried's been played up as just wanting Rosamund to do all the work while he reaps the rewards for himself. But no, the reason he kept complaining is because he wanted Rosamund to take the job so he didn't have to deal with the drama anymore, because it was ruining his life. So does this redeem Wilfried's character? Not entirely. He's still a spoiled brat, but at least he's got a relatable struggle. The two come to an understanding and agree to maintain the status quo. Though Rosamund has to sort out her retainers now, there's a lot of circumstances there, with those who didn't swear their names needing parental permission and such. But her clear priority is in the wrong place, as usual, by asking for permission to start writing to Ferdinand again. Really? After all that Wilfried said? And yeah, she explains he's like Veronica is to Wilfried, someone she cares about. She's worried especially with how much he smelled the potions after the last time she saw him. That's a weird thing to notice. But while she's surprised Wilfried can't tell if it's from brewing or drinking potions, Wilfried has to explain that her common sense is off base. Normal archducal family members wouldn't be brewing for themselves in the first place. Ferdinand's insistence that she knows how to make her own potions and charms is abnormal, and he clearly only does it because he enjoys it so much. Thus we get someone finally saying to Rosamund that Ferdinand has a warped understanding of noble common sense as well. So not only does she have memories from another world, commoner influence, and temple logic, but her noble mentor was an oddball too. Just great. I mean, she can't exactly trust her brewing to her scholars. They're all too busy with administrative work and stuff. But Wilfried tells her to actually let them handle that more in the future, or else their grades will suffer for not being up to par for archducal family retainers, especially Felina and Roderick. As soon as Rosamund steps out, Cornelius is on edge. Not just because it was a private meeting and she was one of the last people to step out, but because she's talking to Wilfried so casually, and she actually has to tell him to relax, but also summon the rest of her retainers to her chambers, including Brunhilde. And once there, she tells them all that was said in confidence, and they're only being told this because they need to figure out their own futures. So she goes on to say that she's being adopted into the royal family, and her engagement to Wilfried is cancelled because she'll be engaged to Sigiswald as soon as she comes of age. Hartmut doesn't look too surprised, despite everyone else being so, until he hears that Wilfried actually agreed to this cancellation. Hartmut's great at gathering information, but his issues probably look the same to Hartmut as they did to us, the audience. Wilfried wanting to cancel this engagement was probably only known by Sylvester and also his retainers. Brunhilde's pretty much locked into not coming due to her impending engagement, which kinda seems like unfortunate timing when you think about it, but she doesn't really regret her decision. To keep supporting her lady, however, she'll make sure the lower city is looked after. But this does bring up Bertilda. She's due to enter Rosemine's service at the academy, but she's not a retainer yet, and she's much too young to accompany her to the sovereignty. Thus, she'll stay behind and join Brunhilde's service once she marries. Next, she informs her namesworn that they're going to accompany her by default, since they have no one else to take care of them. The rest of her underage staff, though, they're going to have to get permission. This is the point where Rosemine makes it clear that from the moment she took their names, she intended to look after them for the rest of her life, which is a pretty important distinction compared to other namesworn we'll see in this series. Felina asks a pretty important question: how will those who follow fare in the academy? Well, they're gonna stay in the Ehrenfest dorm during the school year, as they won't be official sovereign nobles, and Felina's interested in this because she's kinda between these two groups. She's essentially under Rosemine's protection and is her de facto guardian, without actually being her namesworn. So, she has a lot to consider. Hartmut then steps up and demands to give his name to Rosemine right away. That seems kinda silly, the dude's devoted enough, and he said that he wouldn't give his name unless she requested it. But this changes things. He's trying to guarantee a spot following her to the sovereignty. I mean, not to be presumptuous here, but Rosemine assumed that he would pretty much come regardless. Well, more like there was no stopping him, and she would actually feel better with him staying and looking after her stuff on the noble side of things. But probably more important though, is this something he should be saying in front of his bride-to-be? Apparently she's of the same opinion, because she wants to swear her name too. They both say this is a more intimate expression of their true love than exchanging names. They would both rather give theirs to her. Gross as hell. Ottilie is fully given up on controlling these two, and basically just asks Rosemine to take care of them. All of her guard knights say basically the same thing too, because apparently Hartmut's jealousy over her namesworn has been so great, there's been collateral damage in the past. So she accepts, realizing it's probably the best course of action. Clarissa's too, and thus Felina goes with the flow and tries to offer hers too, but Rosemine won't accept hers because her circumstances are too great. She's got a brother in the orphanage she wants to buy, remember? But instead of just flat out telling her no, she tells her to take her time and decide. She does still have a whole year to figure it out, and on that end of the spectrum, Cornelius requests time to decide too, since, you know, he just got Eckhart's estate and he's engaged to Leonore, but Leonore says she'll go with him wherever he decides. Daniel's on the fence as well for a few reasons, but we'll have to circle back to that. Judith and Lieseletta both have to decline because Judith's father is introducing her to a fiancé soon, plus I'm sure he'd love to have her back in Kernberger. We find out Lieseletta is the successor to her house aside from her future engagement, so she has her own circumstances. But Angelica? Well, she couldn't care less, and leaves it up to Rosemine to decide. Well, that's a pretty big ask. But Lieseletta just tells her to go so she doesn't get stuck marrying Bonifatius. The Sovereign Knights Order is full of strong people who might just catch her eye after all. Angelica really do be like that though. Cornelius reins this in by saying this is a matter between their houses, so they'll set up a meeting between Bonifatius, Elvira, Lieseletta, and Angelica. And that means Rosemine's gonna take some rest, because today has been stressful as hell. They wrap it up there and she goes to bed for the night. And the next day, Hartmut bursts in with his namestone all ready for her. Gross. Well, no point in putting it off. So she does it real quick, after seeing Hartmut's actually enjoying this crap, despite it putting everyone else in pain. Double gross. Clarissa doesn't have the ingredients yet, so she's gonna have to do hers at another time. But for now, Hartmut is officially one of Rosemine's namesworn. After that, she heads to her hidden room to write Ferdinand, where she informs him about her securing him a hidden room and getting him immunity from Detlin's crimes, somewhat lying that it was a reward for her helping in the archive, by omitting that it came from her negotiations for her adoption, and tells him about the silver cloth while asking about the phrase she heard from Hortensia. Cool. So when she exits, Cornelius tells her that Elvira wants to have dinner the next night to discuss the handover and suggests she plans to stay the night at the estate. Works for her, but her letter writing still isn't done, as she fires off one to Bridget about paper for Ferdinand's request, another to Lasvam about talking to Sylvester for Ferdinand's luggage, and lastly to the temple to schedule a meeting for the merchants to discuss what occurred at the conference. Not that there's really much to cover this year since they didn't open any trade slots, and negotiations went as they expected. But there's also the issue of her move, which she'll have to discuss with Benno, which she's gonna do in the orphanage director's hidden room. With her name sworn, she can actually swear them to secrecy fairly easily, and that'll keep this information safe. Oh, but which name sworn is she gonna take? Guess we'll finally get some answers this volume. So the next night after dinner, she has Cornelius, Leonor, Lieseletta, and Angelica with her, while Bonifacius, Elvira, and Karstedt are attending this meeting as well. Why Angelica and Lieseletta? Even though it's about Angelica, she's pretty useless to talk to, and Lieseletta is their house's successor, which she just so happens to know what's going on, so she's a good person to negotiate with. Karstedt puts down a sound blocker and kicks things off by saying that everyone there is up to speed with permission, and Angelica is of course the first topic. Rosemine was thoughtful enough to not decide this on her own, so that earns her some praise. This impacts Lieseletta's whole house, Traugot, and unfortunately Bonifacius. So Elvira takes charge as the first wife of her house, and asks Lieseletta how they feel. She's humble and states that Angelica's original engagement and the subsequent compensation for its cancellation was more than they could ever ask for as a med-noble house, and defers to her judgment as long as good relations remain between their two houses. But since Angelica is looking forward to it, they would like to grant her wish to move, and that's about all it really takes for Elvira to agree. They'll discuss it further with her parents once they secure more permission. But what about Cornelius? What's he gonna do? Bonifacius doesn't even give him a choice. Go to the sovereignty and protect Rosemine. Karstedt laments the headache covering for that loss will bring the order, but Bonifacius says that more knights can be trained, especially after that Dunkelfelger ritual and the increased protections. Well damn, guess Cornelius doesn't really have a choice then. But he actually agrees to go after seeing the state of the Sovereign Knight's order in action. He wants to protect Rosemine, and Leonor is in total agreement there. But this does raise the issue of their own marriage. Elvira tells them to put it off for 2 years and use the next to find more adult guards in the sovereignty, so Leonor can then take her leave to have kids. But as they run through the list of who's going and who's staying, the attendance side is looking pretty bad. Since it's just Gresha, she can't have just a single med-noble attendant server as a princess. That would make her a laughingstock. So Elvira asks Lieseletta to go since she's been in her service forever, but she puts up the same excuse. She's her house's successor and engaged to one of Wilfried's scholars. Circumstances just won't let her leave. However, while respecting others' wishes is important, Rosemine needs to make hers known too. Thus Elvira tells her to let Lieseletta know her true desires. In front of everyone there, they push Rosemine into about as embarrassing of a situation as they could, by making her say she wants Lieseletta to join her in the sovereignty, and the sight is so adorable it makes Lieseletta say yes. I mean, let's not kid ourselves, she wanted to go in the first place. Wait, what about that whole being her house's successor in marriage? Well, that's explained in a side story later on. The situation is a bit more dire than we thought, so this is the best option for Lieseletta. And her whole house, honestly. After that embarrassing display, Rosemine tries to retreat to her bedroom for the night at Karstedt's estate, but Elvira insists on joining her, for some reason. Yeah, things are definitely off as she suggests they make a hidden room. She originally planned to do this before Rosemine arrived at their estate, just in case her emotions became too much to handle, but since Ferdinand visited so often, she generally just left that business to him. So she guides Rosemine to the bedside, and they make one together. Though this isn't her first time, since she did make one with Ferdinand. After that, attendants brought in some chairs and a table with some tea, and let Elvira and Rosemine have a private chat alone for once. This pretty much continues the discussion from after dinner, asking if Rosemine will leave Felina and Daniel in Ehrenfest. Although this is an important discussion, Elvira is much more casual here due to the place, but she explains that there's hardly any lay nobles in the sovereignty. They might serve as attendants to arch and med nobles, but scholars and knights serving a princess? Absolutely not. It would therefore be pretty damn dangerous, as people would approach them for marriage or extortion to get closer to Rosemine. It's for their safety and hers that she has them remain in Ehrenfest, but if she insists on bringing them, she could just always order them to get married. At this point, Daniel's gonna need a goddamn divine intervention, so it might as well be from the purported avatar of a goddess, right? Anyway, Elvira's reasoning is that they're the most accustomed to Rosemine's methods and comfortable with dealing with the lower city. It would benefit Ehrenfest, but also Melchior and the temple, as they both know Ferdinand's methods and such. Melchior's retainers won't ask the Blue Robes to educate them on temple matters, so having nobles there is for the best. Originally, Elvira wanted Hartmut to stay on as the high priest until she came of age, but he got the jump on her by swearing his name to her. Whether she ends up taking her lay nobles is up to her, but Elvira at least suggests she waits until she comes of age to move them in the Gutenbergs. Now they can't move the commoners until then because they're still too busy establishing printing. But also, Rosemine doesn't understand the gravity of her position. Sylvester gave her unprecedented freedom, but the royals won't be as considerate. An underage princess obviously wouldn't be leading a countrywide industry, so she'll have to wait regardless, but it would also help keep her true family a secret, right? Wait, Elvira knows? Actually, that's pretty obvious in hindsight. She just didn't vague post about it every damn book. Yeah, she's a talented scholar with a good information network who had Ferdinand and Karstedt approach her about baptizing Rosemine, and immediately called bullshit on the story that Karstedt tried to weave with Rosemary. But Elvira blows past that revelation and gives her another reason why she shouldn't take Felina or accept her name to move. She's the successor to her house. Everything her father is using right now rightfully belongs to her when she comes of age. Her going would just cause issues. So Elvira offers to look after Felina and Rosemine instead. But what about Daniel? He's gonna be in a similar situation, right? Well, men are best left to other men, so perhaps she should ask Bonifacius to look after him? He'd probably agree on the spot. That basically wraps up the discussion, and Elvira takes a moment to get a bit real with Rosemine and share a story. Years before her showing up were some of the worst in Elvira's life. Her marriage was originally purely obligation, as the Lies gangs hoped that Karstedt and Bonifacius would secure them some protection. But that didn't go so well when Veronica's attendant married in as the second wife. Then Rosemary being the third from a med-noble house aligned with the Veronica faction, throwing them into some major chaos. It took Elvira allying with Trudalita to restore balance and maintain appearances with Veronica, especially when Karstedt kept doting on Rosemary. But after her passing, Trudalita had Nicholas, and that made Veronica push for him to become Karstedt's successor. After Adalbert died, Veronica's power hit its peak, and Karstedt retreated into his work to avoid his home life drama, while Elvira was left to fight with Trudalita. Slowly her position as first wife was starting to slip. Ferdinand then went into the temple without his father's protection. Eckhart's wife was then poisoned while pregnant, as Veronica orchestrated a plot to seize her family's house. And then Veronica had the gall to try and get him to serve Wilfried right after that. So Lamprecht took up that duty instead, where he was then forced to court an Arnsbach noble at her request. All of that made Cornelius swear off ever serving anyone in the first place, and only to get grades suitable for his status so he wouldn't stand out. Haldensel faced harsh treatment because of their connection to Elvira, and things were starting to look pretty damn bleak. But then suddenly Veronica was detained, Sylvester quit being her puppet, and then Karstedt shows up at home telling her a commoner shrine maiden responsible for Veronica's downfall is going to be baptized into their family? Yeah, things suddenly took a major twist. But this all led to Haldensel's harvest improving, Ferdinand returning to noble society and raising Eckhart's spirits, saving Lamprecht's job, and then giving Cornelius the motivation to try his best, while also getting Karstedt to spend more time at home due to Ferdinand's frequent visits, letting him and Elvira build a genuine connection on how to raise Rosemine. From Elvira's perspective, Rosemine saved all of her sons, her marriage, and allowed her to indulge in her hobbies, while also bringing much wealth to her home province. Rosemine has given Elvira so much, and now she's left with the really heartbreaking dilemma. As soon as they leave this hidden room, she won't be allowed to show anything but pride for her daughter becoming a princess and her son being handpicked to be a royal retainer, so she says let her grieve for a moment that they're leaving. Elvira actually breaks down into tears here, and this is the point where Rosemine finally understands the true purpose of a hidden room. It's not just a workshop to do potion brewing. This is her first time seeing a noble, let alone Elvira, be so open with her emotions, so it hits her pretty hard too. She starts to cry as well. This is her first real physical connection with another person since she became Rosemine, and really hits home that in Elvira's eyes, Rosemine is her daughter. So honestly, this is one of the sweetest moments in the entire series. The next morning, she wakes up late because she spent a while talking to Elvira about every little thing in the world. But there is one last person Elvira wants to ask Rosemine about at breakfast. Is she planning on taking her artist with her? Oh, you mean Wilma? Yeah, she's going. Or at least she'll ask her. But Elvira makes it clear. She's a Grey Shrine Maiden. If Rosemine doesn't take her with her to the Sovereignty, Elvira's gonna go buy her. She's way too talented to just leave in the temple. And suddenly Rosemine's hit with the realization that things could easily go back to how they were. Like all those changes she made could suddenly disappear like they were never there. So she'll have to consider how she's gonna approach her commoner servants more carefully. She then informs Daniel about their conversation last night, essentially giving him an ultimatum to either propose to Felina and come to the Sovereignty, or stay there in Ehrenfest. So he needs to figure out his next move. But just then, an ordinance from Sylvester arrives saying that 12 magic tools just arrived from the Sovereignty for children. She races over and wonders what the hell. Are they trying to back out of their deal or what? They were promised 40. Why are they only sending 12? But no, she just assumed the wrong thing. This is just a down payment, not the whole order. It's meant to be a show of good faith. So Rosemine asks Sylvester again if they could send some of these to the orphanage children, and he says sure, if they can meet a med noble standard of mana. So he tells her to have Hartmut interview them and put together candidates for him to talk to personally, specifically ones who won't cause trouble. That'll be rough. So back at the temple, she listens to reports, and everything is ready for the spring coming of age. But she drops the news on her temple attendants, and asks that they serve Melchior and keep the temple as she left it to the best of their abilities. They were already operating under the assumption that she'd leave after coming of age, so really this just moves up their timeline. She says to Fran that she had hoped to move him to her library, but she recalls him saying a while ago that he'd be uncomfortable outside the temple, or at least in the noble's quarter. Elvira just got done scolding Rosemine for not being honest with her true feelings and making requests of people. We, the audience, know that Fran would go with Rosemine if she asked from the side story in Part 4, Volume 9. But she's basing all this on an assumption that she heard Fran talk about way back when he went to Ferdinand's estate before he started serving her. Unfortunately, Fran doesn't have the backbone to ask to follow. But Wilma will actually have a choice. Either be bought by Rosemine or Elvira. Either way, she's going to become a full-time artist. Great, but what's gonna happen to the orphanage without her? Well, either Monica or Lily can take over as Melchior's attendant, but after telling Wilma to think it over, they say not to worry too much, as Melchior won't treat the Grey Robes poorly. But next is the magic tool discussion, so Wilma will explain the situation to those with mana, and those who are the best fit will have a chat with Hartmut about becoming nobles. With that settled, she tells Fritz to gather as many Taus as he can for papermaking, and has Roderick and Felina make the lower-end rejuvenation potions for the orphanage children. And for that, Felina actually has a request. She wants some for Conrad so he can become a noble too. Okay, if he wants to, she can give him some of the ones they're making. But Felina seems to have kinda lost the plot here. Wasn't she gonna swear her name and buy Conrad? Now she wants to make him a noble? Rosemine can't go looking after her freshly baptized child like she can a name-sworn, especially in the Sovereignty. It's just gonna be way too dangerous for her to bring Conrad along. Plus, raising a noble kid requires money, something Felina doesn't really have a ton of since all of her pay is going towards supporting herself. So if she wants to make Conrad a noble, Rosemine suggests Felina return home and reclaim her position as her family's head. That raises some issues, like could he be baptized with Sylvester as his guardian? I mean, sure, but then he'd be assumed to be a child of a criminal. Also, that would sever their family bond. Really, she just needs to talk this out with Conrad and see what he wants for his future. And listening to this conversation is Daniel. Stash that information away for now. So later in the orphanage, Hartmut tests the kid's mana and there are two candidates who meet the threshold. One is a toddler who probably doesn't know what's going on, so they can just give him a tool and he can decide what he wants to do later on. But the last one is Dirk. Surprisingly enough, did you think he wasn't important to the story after part 2? Well, you'd be wrong. So why does he want a magic tool? Well, his plan is to become a noble so he can either become the High Bishop, High Priest, or Orphanage Director to protect the temple. He knows firsthand how powerless Grey Robes can be in the face of nobles, but a good noble in the right place can make a huge difference. Just like Rosemine and Melchior. And Dirk wants to be that noble to keep Rosemine's legacy alive. But this does mean he won't be able to call Delia his sister anymore, right? That breaks her heart, and she's begging him to stop, but he shows resolve, because if he doesn't, they can be torn apart just as easily as before. So this is his way of protecting her. With that resolve, he asks Hartmut to make him a noble, and Hartmut explains just how hard this is going to be. He'll be treated as a criminal without Rosemine there to protect him. So does he still want it? Yeah, he does. This is basically the capstone to Dirk and Delia's character arcs, where Delia started off as an antagonistic force, but now she sings Rosemine's praises every day. It's really sweet to see a character who's been mostly absent from the story for the past 3 parts to get a heartfelt moment. As Dirk and Delia bicker over his rash decision, attention turns over to Felina and Conrad. She explains that she has the potions and their mother's magic tool to make him a noble, but Conrad actually refuses. He feels safe in the temple and he honestly has grown to like his life there, but he also lays out the logical reasons why he shouldn't take it. Mainly that it's too expensive and it would just be too much of a struggle for them to survive. As for purchasing him, he won't be of any use to her, and she even admits it would just be a personal indulgence on her part to spend time with her little brother. She explains her 3 paths forward, and where Conrad fits into them. Either she gives her name to Rosemine and never looks back, waits until she comes of age to leave Ehrenfest, or decides to stay and returns home to support him if he becomes a noble. But before she decides, She wants to know what he wants. So this is basically Conrad's farewell to his big sister, by saying she should keep their mother's magic tool and use it for her own kids someday. As for his plans, he wants to become a merchant blue priest who can support Melchior and Dirk when he gets a position of power, because Conrad looks up to Freitag, who earns his own keep in the temple. So Felina has her answer. She'll stay until she comes of age and support Conrad in the temple. Back in her chambers, Rosamine remarks how composed Felina was, and as it turns out, Damiel scolded her. She kinda flew off the handle asking Rosamine for more support out of nowhere, but Damiel actually stepped up like a man for once, and said he'd propose and support them as her fiancé if she decided to make Conrad a noble. Good for him, but it didn't turn out that way, now did it? Plus, she didn't view it as a proper proposal in the first place. So Felina says that once she's an independent woman, she'll propose to Damiel instead, since she's been getting advice on how to do it from Clarissa. We can only assume it's a traditional Dunkelfelger proposal, knife and all. The next day, Rosamine's gonna meet with Benno, so she explains it'll be a super private meeting where Damiel will guard her in her hidden room. But Hartmut insists on joining them as well, since, you know, he's a namesworn now, and she's gonna need a scholar. That doesn't sound good, but I guess she can always swear him to secrecy. So what's the harm, right? While doing paperwork, she discusses the orphanage director's position with Melchior. He doesn't really know who to put in charge since the skill set is part scholar, part attendant, but also a woman would probably be the best. And he doesn't have any of those in his service. Rosamine insists an archducal family member's retainer should take the position to keep an eye on the former Veronica faction children. And hey, an idea strikes her from that. Felina's gonna be here for the next few years, and she wants to keep an eye on her little brother. So, why not make her the orphanage director, since it comes with a salary and all? That's kind of out of left field, but after thinking it over, Felina accepts. Cool, that's taken care of. After lunch, she heads into her hidden room with Hartmut and Damiel in tow. He's flipping out over finally being inside, but when Benno comes in, Hartmut drops a pretty hefty bombshell. He tells her to discuss whatever she wants at her leisure, since he already knows she's a former commoner. But not just that Gunther is her father and she's worked with Benno since before joining the temple. Yeah, he figured all this out just by listening to the commoners in the workshop. That's why he spent so much time there, carefully eliminating all the inconsistencies, and eventually approached Ferdinand with this information for confirmation, despite the risk of him being executed. This is why Ferdinand let her put so much trust in Hartmut, because the dude already knew Rosamine's biggest secret and was still this fanatical about her. The reason he didn't tell her earlier though is because he didn't want it to seem like he was blackmailing her. And you know, this was still pretty hard-earned information. Why would he tell anyone until the time was right? Which just so happens to be now. All those hints he's been dropping for multiple volumes now? Yeah, Hartmut knew and he didn't tell a soul. It's just such a great reveal because it's entirely expected that both Hartmut knew and he wouldn't care less that she's a commoner. Hell, in his eyes, it makes her even more of a saint. Okay, she's already got a headache, but proceeds with Benno and tells him she'll be leaving in a year's time for some reason she can't go into, but she won't need any of her commoner associates for another 3 years after she comes of age, since she won't have the freedom to set up a new industry where she's going. Yeah, Benno's played this game far too many times to count, so he'll prepare for a year instead. Plans with her always get accelerated out of nowhere, so it's better to be ready sooner rather than later. So is she gonna make her Gutenbergs follow? Not unless they want to. But those who wish to stay, she'll have them make a big trip to her new home and set up a printing workshop, like all their different yearly trips to provinces. But this does raise a pretty good point. What about the temple's workshop? Now that's duchy property, not hers, despite her being the forewoman. But is she planning to take the priests who work there like Gil and Fritz? And she flat out says she is. She's gonna purchase them and Nicola and move them with Felina, and thus she extends that same offer to join her to Benno, assuming he's not gonna be too busy to handle it, that is. And thus she loads him with even more work, selling her all of the Trombe paper he has in stock right now, and she's using Ferdinand's funds for it, since it's going to him anyway. Back in her chambers, Rosamine has Felina start going over the budget and stuff with Monica, whom she'll be transferring to her service after she leaves, and opens up her hidden room for the incoming Trombe paper to be stored. That's when an ordinance arrives from Bridget, asking when they should deliver the Fae paper she ordered. Roderick suggests doing all the brewing at the castle so Clarissa can help, but that would lead to some prying eyes and questions. Damiel reminds her of the library's workshop that's available to her too. That one also has a plethora of ingredients. So she has Bridget send the paper to the castle tomorrow, and she'll have Lieseletta bring it on over to her library. That way everyone can meet there. And at the library, she meets up with Lasfam while the Fae paper is being taken to the workshop. He wants to know why Sylvester's handling Ferdinand's stuff now, since Ferdinand originally entrusted it to her, but she explains how it was a bad look for them both. But the news that Ferdinand is receiving a hidden room and Rosamund got him spared from punishment has Lasfam pretty pleased. His life was on the line too. But what about the books? How many should he send to Ferdinand with his luggage? And the answer is none. They're all hers now, right? However, Lasfam explains that some of those are Hilda Marie's, and Eckhart would probably appreciate seeing them. Okay, so why does Ferdinand have all those? Well, it's a pretty complicated and long story that's barely touched on in the mainline books. Here's about the extent we get. I mentioned earlier this video how Veronica plotted to overtake Hilda Marie's house via a second wife, much like how Trudalita did with Karstedt's, and books are typically a family's proprietary magical knowledge. So when this plot began, Hilda Marie tried to get as many books out of her house as she could and kept them to Ferdinand to protect. Now, if you actually did slip through the cracks and were sold, one we've actually seen in this story before. That was the first book mine saw back in part 1. Eckhart had a hard time going into Ferdinand's bookroom because it reminded him so much of his late wife. But lately though, he's been looking upon those books fondly. And that's about when Clarissa comes in saying they're ready to start brewing. Alright, so I said last video, maximal quality has a definition in this series, which means it's of the highest quality in either mana capacity or elements. Ferdinand wants maximal quality in terms of mana capacity, and since all of their Fey paper is made through commoners, it has a low capacity, which really just means they have a ton of work to do. Now Ferdinand didn't say it had to be plant paper, but this is what they have on hand. It would take much too long to go get some high quality Fey Beast paper, so they're gonna have to use what they got on hand. After some messing around by removing impurities, adding ingredients, and just a ton of trial and error, Rosamund's feeling defeated. And I mean, that's not really fair. They've made a ton of progress. The Effen paper has a better quality sound, and the non-set paper moves together at a faster pace. But this isn't the progress she's expecting. That's mostly because this trial and error crap isn't her speed. She's used to just following Ferdinand's recipes. The Heartmoon and Clarissa reassure her this is amazing progress for a single day, mostly due to just how much mana she has to throw at the problem. After lunch, Rosamund tries making some gold dust and adding it, but that's a pretty absurd step. Most scholars consider that process a waste of mana, so her just doing it on a whim is insane. But it does actually show a massive improvement in the paper. It's now high quality and omni-elemental. There is one major drawback though, only she can use it. No one else can even write on it. Great. On top of that, Hartmut and Clarissa get distracted thinking up new uses for this paper, but ultimately they call it there for the day after deciding to make some gold dust for themselves. That way they can try this recipe and see if Rosamund can use theirs. And the next day it's a no-go, though the new Effen paper can actually cast spells, and the non-set paper can reattach itself now. The hope was they might actually be able to combine these two, that way they could have reusable spells. But no, not quite yet. And with Clarissa's gold dust, Rosamund still can't write on this paper. The mana in the paper seems to be repelling hers. So why not try adding a darkness ingredient? Like, I don't know, the Trombe paper? And that leads to basically brewing the 3 papers together to create something insane. Something that lets you draw the magic circle on it, activate the spell, and it doesn't burn up. And hey, they finally reached maximal quality, but the requirements for it were equally insane. Needing gold dust and all, just one sheet took Clarissa a whole night. So making 300 sheets of this would be pretty much impossible, especially in the time frame. While the ones they have are mostly just samples for Ferdinand to examine during the funeral, so I guess they can just wait to hear back from him about their recipe. I'm sure he'll have some thoughts. That's gonna give him a headache just looking at it. Okay, time for spring coming of age. That means the Arnsbach funeral is right around the corner. Because they're so low on manpower, Rosamund wants Melchior and the apprentice Blue Robes to participate as well. It would also give Melchior some experience performing these ceremonies, but when she brought the idea up to Fran, he refused immediately. Those who are underage shouldn't be performing ceremonies, I guess, but that's fucking rich. Ferdinand made her perform Spring Prayer and the Harvest Festival, and hell, she does a ton more now. She's still underage. I mean, I guess that's because she's the High Bishop, but even before then, when she was an apprentice Shrine Maiden, she still did ceremonies. Okay, but they had that massive manpower shortage back then, which has only gotten worse. Yeah, Fran played himself here. She wants them to perform the Harvest Festival in fall, and they're gonna need as much experience as they can get before she leaves next year. This is all for the temple's sake. But Fran tells her to at least give them until the summer's coming of age to prepare, and that'll give them just enough time to be ready for the fall ceremonies. Plus, they want to consult the other Blue Robes to get their thoughts on this. Now, the actual coming of age is a bit rough this season. Why's that? Well, Tuli's is in the summer, but one of her childhood acquaintances is actually coming of age this season. Lutz's brother, Ralph. She managed to dodge his others when she was in a coma, but not this time. As she steps out onto the stage, she tries to find him among the crowd until she spots someone she thinks might be him. After burning a hole in his head by staring for way too long, the guy's staring back at her sorta suspiciously too. Did that actually give her away? Who knows? After firing off the blessing at the end, he still keeps looking back. I guess someone will say something to her if Ralph points out she looks like mine, and that's if he even remembers. And after that, they hold a meeting for the upcoming ceremonies in the temple, where the blue priests are actually pretty fed up with their workload. They want the apprentices to pull their weight. Thus, she informs the apprentices they'll need ceremonial robes, staff, carriages, and to learn the ceremonies to head out this coming fall. Nicholas asks if she thinks that Karstead will cover his winter preparations costs, and she answers that he most likely will. Just write to him and ask. Now Nicholas is worried that Elvira will refuse him because she doesn't like him, and that's true enough. But she won't refuse a reasonable request because Elvira just isn't that sort of person. Either way, that won't be an excuse for him to slack on preparing for these ceremonies and to pray sincerely to get divine protections. And he plans to, because Bonifatius stopped by and trained him and told him the exact same thing. At that, Judith suggests she send a thank you because it'll benefit those stuck training right now. Why? Well, when Bonifatius is in a good mood, he goes a lot easier on the trainees. Rosemine's thanks are what puts him in the best mood of all. Well, Matthias will thank her later. Back at the castle later, she's having dinner with the family before Sylvester is due to depart. Rosemine's running over the laundry list of things for him to do for Ferdinand, aside from just dropping off his luggage, like give him the Fey paper and confirm he has a hidden room with his own eyes, which was annoying until he realized it might actually be fun to bother Ferdinand by doing it. Florencia asks if she's gonna stay in the castle while he's out, and that's the plan. But after she's done dedicating mana and such, she has to bail back to the temple and harvest Trombe in secret. And that's when Charlotte mentions that they have a tea party scheduled between all the kids. And when it's time for Sylvester to leave, they see him off with a train of carriages lugging all of Ferdinand's crap. But when heading back to her chambers, she mentions how long it's been since all of her retainers were in one place. And Judith is pretty mad that Lieseletta is going with Rosemine now, since that basically means she's the only one left in Ehrenfest, but she extends the offer that if Judith wants to come to the sovereignty after coming of age for a short while before getting married, she's welcome to it. Which leaves Daniel as pretty much the only one who's undecided at this point. But before she can ask him, Clarissa announces that she's finally got her name stone ready. So back in her chambers, they perform the ceremony, and Clarissa actually gives a normal reaction to discomfort, unlike Hartmut did. You're probably noticing at this point that the pace is picked up quite a bit. That's because the day-to-day activities here are just handover work, which is pretty boring to read about. So the author's instead focusing on the important stuff, like name swearing, character decisions, and how the blue robes are fitting in. That's kind of the rest of this volume, now that the heavy stuff is out of the way. Don't worry, you're probably gonna miss that sort of stuff after next volume hits. Clarissa had made a ton of headway in her work in the castle. She assembled all the documents relating to Rosemine establishing the workshop in the temple to copy the process in the sovereignty. And as it turns out, Ferdinand did a lot of behind the scenes work that she never realized, and it makes her understand just how crazy she'd been acting back then. That's why he always demanded that she inform him what she was doing and scheduled meetings so far in advance. Yeah, that seemed like a pain at the time, but it was so they could actually get approval for this crap first. Well, it's time for their siblings' tea party, and they start by clearing the room at Charlotte's request and using a sound blocker. Wow, this is a grown-up discussion. Rosemine jumps the gun to power it herself after some debate, but Charlotte wants her to stop shouldering everything and being so considerate. She doesn't really think she is, or has been, mostly feeling like Charlotte is just better than her in every way. But on the contrary, in Charlotte's eyes, Rosemine pushing Sylvester to let her choose her own marriage partner was a pretty big consideration, and even with this adoption, she's giving Charlotte options for her future. Hell, because of Rosemine, Charlotte hasn't known what life is like as a bottom-ranked Archduke candidate. Those in their 30s taught her how different things used to be, and that's also let her pinpoint the generational shift. Yeah, it turns out, it's actually Ferdinand. Who'd have thought? His hard work in the academy forced others to improve despite not impacting their rank, but Daniel's generation was the post-Civil War one, and they jumped to a middle rank pretty much overnight. Subsequently, they were the last to know Ehrenfest as a bottom-ranked duchy, but then Cornelius' generation came in at a much higher rank, along with those improved learning materials earning them praise. But when Rosemine and Wilfried started attending is when things got crazy. So while they've been criticized for not acting their rank, their mindset is already changing quite a bit from the older generations. We already knew that Ferdinand didn't change Ehrenfest's standing in the academy, but we also knew that Daniel's generation admired him a ton, so it only makes sense that his generation and younger understand the value of interduchy politics. Basically, Charlotte's plan is to keep the changes Rosemine instituted going while protecting her industries, which she's pretty good at, but this segues her into what she really wanted to discuss: who's the best candidate for Ob, and she believes it's her, at least currently. That might change as Melchior and her new sibling grow, so she's once again asking Rosemine for her support. Is this ideal? Not really, since she'd be serving as an interim Ob like Detlind is, but without the king-appointed spouse to assist her. Thus she'd be looking for a husband in the academy willing to come, but not rule the duchy with her. However, leaving isn't exactly a great choice either, because the contract Charlotte signed to learn Rosemine's mana compression method might run the risk of making Charlotte her enemy in some way. Yikes, they never considered that. But I mean, it's always been a possibility, and one that Charlotte was aware of when she signed the contract. Yeah, she knew the consequences, and states that she'll always be Rosemine's ally no matter what, because they're sisters. Wilfried surprisingly seconds that, saying Ehrenfest will always support her. I mean, even if they are a pretty weak shield. Yeah, it's a bit of a touching moment, undercut by some comedy routine, but they do ask if hiding this adoption even has a point, since rumors are already flying around about her impending move. Yeah, even by not mentioning it to anyone, it's clear that she's getting her affairs in order and passing off work. Plus, the people attending the Archduke conference heard about her becoming the Sovereign High Bishop, so, in essence, word is already out. Wilfried asks if she's going to be made the High Bishop in the Sovereign Temple, but she says that's unlikely. Since she made it clear that the royals would have to do religious work, they tried to pawn it all off on her. I would say that ordering a royal around is the least of their concerns with her. But just then, an ordinance flies in for Rosemine from Hartmut, informing her that the Lies Gang elders showed up at the castle and are demanding a meeting with Florencia to ask if Rosemine is being sent to the Sovereign Temple. Goddamn, that's not good. Did they seriously wait for Sylvester to leave? So while the kids jump into action, Rosemine and Wilfried will confront the elders, while Melchior and Charlotte get Florencia out of the room because she's pregnant. They don't want her going through this sort of stress. Charlotte shows some concern for Wilfried at facing down the Lies Gangs after their previous abuse, but he basically makes his stance known. He's not going to be the next Ob anymore, so he doesn't need their support, just like Sylvester told him. So as they head off, Rosemine has Leonor inform Bonifatius, Elvira, and Guy Bleisgang about the sudden commotion at the castle. Well, this has been building since Volume 4, but we finally get to see the Lies Gangs put in their place. As they get to where the meeting is being held, they bump into Liebrecht outside, who's pretty surprised to see 4 Archduke candidates racing towards him. But when they ask to be let inside since this meeting is about them, he looks pretty troubled. At least until he pops in to ask for Florencia's permission, then he's just resigned. So they enter, and the Lies Gang elders are pretty happy to see their savior in the flesh. But they also double down on their pleas to get Florencia to talk some sense into Sylvester, and make sure Rosemine doesn't leave Ehrenfest. In their opinion, if the sovereignty requires an Archduke candidate to serve as the High Bishop, make Wilfried take that post up instead. Which is pretty much how they mocked him during Spring Prayer. Rosemine tries to get Florencia to leave so they can handle this, but Florencia stands her ground. And since that's a non-starter, she looks to the Lies Gangs and starts on them regardless. She's not leaving, and why the hell did they even think that? Apparently the rumors from the Archduke conference are to blame, and they aren't comfortable leaving Ehrenfest in the hands of an Archduke who doesn't heed their concerns. Bonifatius bursts in at this point to make sure Rosemine is safe, confirming he didn't tip them off. And this is when we see just how bad Wilfried screwed up when he originally visited Lies Gang during Spring Prayer. He tells them Rosemine isn't being sent to the Sovereign Temple, and someone's obviously tricking them. They snap back at him, and Rosemine has to intervene, telling them to calm down. But also, their remarks to Wilfried just aren't cool. If they want Wilfried in the temple so badly, Rosemine leaving would basically secure that, since he wouldn't have a support base and Melchior isn't old enough to be the High Bishop yet. And then their treatment of Wilfried would really come back to bite them in the ass, as their chalices for Spring Prayer would suddenly dry up. That's a pretty hefty threat. Lies Gang prides themselves on their crop production after all, but since religious ceremonies they all look down on so much are increasing crop yields even in Haldensel, their position as the breadbasket is far from secure. Would she really turn her back on her home and family though? Damn right, since she's the High Bishop and the Archduke's adopted daughter. Why wouldn't she turn her back on those who belittle her work? And that's not just because of the whole religion thing, but also the lowering of their rank is added in too. Screw these guys. Wilfried proceeds to shove his foot in his mouth once again and suggests the elders join the temple if they're so worried about their harvest. They're basically retired but still have mana to give. Why not, right? And Rosemine suddenly understands immediately that she's not the only one who's lacking socializing experience. Yeah, it's pretty much both parties' fault that Spring Prayer went so poorly, but Melchior backs up Wilfried by saying their mana would help when he attends the Royal Academy, and suddenly the dressing down of the Lies Gangs begins in full force. By the time Geep Lies Gang comes to get them, they're pretty defeated. He explains that yes, their actions were wrong, but they did it out of concern for Rosemine, so he asks that they're not too harshly punished, mostly asking Rosemine to not take their chalices away, but she gives them a single out. Lies Gang just needs to start supporting Sylvester more. Checkmate. But before they leave, Geep Lies Gang asks if Wilfried really understands what his grandmother did to Lies Gang to make them resent him so much. That information hasn't quite sunken in yet, despite being told by his parents and retainers, so he gives them this last piece of advice. He should really reflect on how others view him before he acts. Back at the temple, Hartmut has a report on who riled up the Lies Gangs, and as it turns out, Lieberecht's odd behavior was the smoking gun. Florencia was luring them into a trap so she could squash them by causing a scene to get them arrested. Rosemine's actions threw a wrench into that plan, obviously, but it does seem to have worked out in the end. Thus, Hartmut received some advice from his father. If a situation looks weird, it's probably a trap, and he should let it play out more to see who's pulling the strings before leaping into action, especially if his lady could get harmed in the process. Also, Florencia is the one who leaked that information to Barthold so he would leak it to the Lies Gangs, purely out of spite. She did that in hopes that he would actually take action against Barthold finally. That didn't happen though. Yeah, seems like he still has a lot to learn. Later on, Sylvester comes back and he has a ton of gifts. Awesome. Rosemine heads to the castle to greet him with her retainers, and there's a huge hall of carriages waiting, more than he actually left with, strangely enough. But Sylvester is visibly annoyed, at her specifically. Why? Well, as it turns out, most of these carriages are for her. Some of these are full of dishes from the food she sent over to Ferdinand. The returned magic tools are all full of food too. Then there's even some ingredients and crap, not just for brewing, but even cooking. Okay, this all needs sorted through, and now isn't the time, obviously. She'll have the food taken to the temple, some cloth she received as a gift to her chambers. Most of the other crap is gonna go to her library. Dinner's when they can actually discuss what happened at the funeral, and it was certainly a crazy one. Ferdinand got his hidden room and subsequently spent most of the funeral locked inside of it, pulling all-nighters looking over the papers she sent him. Now this whole process came at a pretty bad time, as his retainers had to orchestrate his move to the western building, while also setting up the funeral and handling negotiations with Lanzanov. But Ferdinand had fun, so what's the harm? Sylvester was more concerned about Lanzanov and the Sovereign Knight's order, as during the actual funeral, there was a massive commotion. No one really knows what happened, but apparently some knights got violent out of nowhere. Some were executed right away while the rest were sent back to the sovereignty. Yeah, no one was hurt, but it's still pretty weird. It also happened so fast, no one really knows the details. But by the next day, word had spread that they attacked Detlin by order of the royal family. And after she raised a fuss about it, the general mistrust in the royal family has grown. Ferdinand tried to get her to calm down, but she just blew him off. Big surprise there. And it seems that the king of Lanzanov's grandson was doting on Detlin more than Ferdinand, so the impression was that she's basically cheating on her fiancé. Fantastic news. There's some important information in that flashback, but the key takeaways here are the lack of trust in the sovereignty and Detlin's new boy toy. But Charlotte raises a good point, segueing away from Detlin's possible infidelity here. Why did Lanzanov have representatives at the funeral if they're located outside the country? Well, since Arnsbach has the only open country gate, Lanzanov has representatives there from spring until fall, overseeing merchants coming back and forth. There's negotiations in there too, but that's not the whole thing. Something to note though, they were wearing some very strange silver clothes. Before Bonifatius can even ask the most obvious question, Sylvester says he couldn't get close enough to get a good look, but Ferdinand was brought up to speed at least, so he knows about it. As for the envoy itself, they stood out a lot, since their royal family there in Lanzanov has Jürgen Schmidt blood, so they actually look different than the native population of the country. The royals all have fair skin like those in Jürgenschmidt, while the natives have darker complexions and different features. So with that, they wrap up dinner, where Sylvester tells Rosamund she has letters to respond to too, but to prioritize the one from Letizia first or else she'll probably forget. And back in her room, she would like to respond, but those were actually sent over to the library. Yeah, instead she'll have to focus on the cloths she received. Her attendants pick out some of each divine color for her, and then some to give to Florencia, Charlotte, Elvira, and even Aurelia, assuming she would like a gift from home. But here's the kicker, it actually requires hosting a tea party to give a gift in noble society. Damn, their customs are a hassle. Well, couldn't she just give this to Florencia to handle the distribution? I mean, they could, but then it would seem like a gift from her. They do need to keep up appearances about her engagement to Wilfried, but also Florencia's position is the weakest in Ehrenfest right now. With Wilfried out of the running for Ob, the Lies gangs are going to push for Brunhilde's first child to be the next Archduke for sure. Because Rosamund won't be there, remember? Yeah, when she was accepted as the second wife, there was zero chance of her children being prioritized over Rosamund and Wilfried's because they're so close in age. But their engagement ending changes things a lot. So wouldn't Rosamund also prioritize her former retainer and blood relative Brunhilde? Well, no. Rosamund would rather strengthen Charlotte and Florencia's positions. So half is given to Florencia to distribute as she pleases, while Rosamund keeps the other half, with a chunk going to her retainers as gifts. And at the library the next day, her scholars sort through the brewing ingredients, her chefs in Grescia handle the spices, and she goes to her hidden room to read and write letters. And first up is Letizia, who basically just writes about her mundane lessons with Ferdinand and how strict he is. We're seeing she's feeling the pressure, as after Detlin's blunders, her education intensified quite a bit. But she mentions how the sweets that Rosamund gave her helped with her motivation a lot. Message received, Rosamund will send some more. But the spices and ingredients Rosamund got in return came with recipes for her to try out as well. Now she can incorporate Arnsbach cooking into her style. Awesome, maybe she'll send some of that over too. So this letter seems pretty damn pointless, until you realize it's setting up Letizia's mental state going into the climax. On to Ferdinand's, which should be full of praise, right? Of course not. They're full of criticism. First off, she overstepped by negotiating to get him a hidden room as a mere fiancé. Apparently this was taken to mean that he and Detlin should share the Ob's chambers before their starbind, which is unthinkable, obviously. We know how prudish this culture is. So Arnsbach dragged their feet until the last second before the funeral, when they gave Ferdinand Georgine's old room as the third wife in the West Building. Obviously they had to check it for traps and poison and such. That put a huge burden on all of his retainers there to facilitate his move and the funeral at the same time. But the biggest complaint Ferdinand had was he could no longer track Georgine's movements as easily as he could when he was in the main building. Though based on how he's writing, he still appreciates the hidden room quite a bit. Moving past that, he provides a report on Arnsbach's factions concerning Lanzanov. After their princess was refused, Detlin took such an interest in the Lanzanov plight after talking to them that she tried to arrange a meeting between them and the king to negotiate again at the funeral, while also offering free face stones at the height of their mana crisis as compensation. What the hell is she thinking? Well, she isn't. Not with her head at least. Ferdinand yelled at her to knock her crap off, but she didn't, and even said he never loved her before storming off to the Lanzanov villa. It's gotten so bad, Georgine has actually had to drag her out of there on more than one occasion. But really, just note that this puts Georgine in direct contact with the Lanzanov envoys, broadening the scope of who's in play in her schemes. But Detlind is such a disgrace that this caused Ferdinand to intensify his training in Letizia. That explains her complaints. On to the last letter, which is entirely about the Fey paper she sent, and it indeed gave Ferdinand a headache. Her recipe was incredibly mana inefficient, but also super high in quality, so he improved upon it, and requests her to move forward on his 300-sheet order. All the ingredients he sent were for said order too. Talk about a waste of a gift. But as she transcribes the recipe for Hartmut and Clarissa to churn out for him, she notices his last line written to her. What is her Geduld? That has a lot of implications. As we know, from hometown to person you love. But what does Ferdinand mean here exactly? Honestly, she can only picture his blank, emotionless face. So is he asking her what she holds dear? Or did he catch wind of her soon departure from Ehrenfest? She doesn't know, and honestly, things are already in motion for her to save him, so she decides to write around the answer in her response and focus on brewing instead. After Heartmoon and Clarissa see the improved recipe, they're thoroughly impressed. It's good enough that they can make it themselves without needing to rely on Rosemine's mana quantity. Granted, it does take them longer to make and uses more ingredients, but this is overall better because they can do it themselves. And as it turns out, Ferdinand will finish the final step himself, so they don't even have to finish the whole paper. But Clarissa notes their stock of fireproof paper isn't going to be enough. So how is she going to get more since they bought out the Plankton Company on it? Well, Rosemine will just have to make some, and that's a trade secret, even if Clarissa's name's sworn. And with that, she sorts through the spices so she can head back to the temple for the Starbind and handover. Judith takes her letters back to the castle while she somehow tries to fit making a curry-like dish from these new ingredients into her schedule. We'll see if that actually comes to fruition. She's pretty busy. And once in the temple, she has Fritz gather the Taus they need for their mini Trombe hunt, while making sure the kids who have mana don't gather those days to avoid an incident. Once they are gathered, she heads down to the orphanage with Lorenz, Matthias, and Hartmut. But when the knights see the kids with their hatchets and gathering tools, they're definitely suspicious. What's gonna happen here? Rosemine makes it clear they're gonna harvest growy, stretchy trees for fireproof paper, and they're not to speak a word of what they see here today, using the mana enveloping them through name swearing to enforce that order, meaning if they refuse, they would actually die. After they agree, she has them step back and throws a Tau, which turns into a Trombe pod right away. It sucks so little of her mana that she barely even felt it, hitting home that this wouldn't have been a long-time solution for her mana issues as a commoner. The knights are shocked to see a Trombe sprout, but even more so that commoners are killing it with ease. Remember, in their experience, it takes somebody with a black weapon. These are commoners without mana killing a Trombe. Goddamn. Rosemine explains that as long as commoners get them before they get too big, they can take care of them no problem. But if Taus are Trombes and also used in lower city celebrations, shouldn't the Knights Order go mobilize and wipe them out before they sprout? And I mean, they could, but that would be a massive hassle, waste of resources, while also ruining the fun of the Star Festival. The commoners' human wave tactics prove effective enough as control, and while there is the issue of a Trombe happening with all these mana-rich kids in the orphanage, they're not going to be hunting them again after this. Rosemine's leaving, and this secret leaves with her. So, that was their last Trombe hunt for paper. It's a bit sentimental as this does mark the end of an era where Rosemine somewhat participates in an activity she did as a commoner. For the Starbind, Rosemine accidentally blows a huge blessing load all over Zack. Damn, this much just for him? How bad is Thule's coming of age gonna be at the end of the season? Anyway, he married a childhood friend who's 3 years younger and always supported him in his career. She's also eagerly listened to his stories about his travels, and kinda wants to do it too. But the real event this chapter isn't the Starbind, but on her way to the Noble Quarter with Damiel and her High Beast. They get the chance to talk alone here for a second, where he asks her what he should do about his upcoming move. He's basically given up on marriage at this point, since he took Felina's decision as a refusal of his proposal. But she flat out tells him he'd better brace himself. His proposal is not only coming, it's gonna be a Clarissa-inspired one. Felina doesn't want to be some little sister figure he protected. She wants Damiel to recognize her as a woman. But as for past that, she says she would like him to come to the sovereignty since he's a unifying force for her retainers, but he also knows about her past and can protect the lower city she cares about so much. Both of these options are important to Rosemine, so whichever choice he makes, she'll support him. And as they get closer to the castle, he's finally made up his mind. He's staying in Ehrenfest. If Felina does marry him, they'll move to the sovereignty later on, but if not, he'll protect her honor by remaining there instead. Back at the temple, they tell Melchior the news that Bonifacius agreed to look after Damiel, so he's gonna stay on as an advisor at the temple as well. That sucks, because Melchior kind of wanted him in his service, but Rosemine's not handing over her retainers without a fight. Leonore even mentions that she might want to do something to help those who are staying behind. She can craft a sort of personal seal that essentially tells others that those wearing it are under her protection. Usually a family seal would work here, but she's leaving Ehrenfest and won't be able to use the Ehrenfest seal for it. Thus, the Rosemine workshop seal she made all the way back in part 2 comes into play. So she plans to make one for Felina, Judith, and Damiel who are staying behind. But she's also going to make some for her commoner family and personnel who are coming too. And while it's easy enough for her to make face stone charms for them, constantly redrawing that crest on magic paper is a pain in the ass. Rosemine offhandedly tries to copy and paste the crest using her shop, which works inexplicably. But hey, new spell just dropped. Cool. Too bad she misspoke, and copy and paste is now copy and place in Jurgenschmidt. Well, it's not the first weird spell she's invented for this world. Later, when Karina and the Gilberta company come to measure for some new outfits, she hands off her charms to those who are coming with her. Thule's there, so she gets some for her family back home. But while chatting with Thule, the topic of her coming of age comes up, and she's insistent on getting a normal blessing after that embarrassment that happened to Zach earlier. Well, I guess she's back to using face stones for that then. Hell, she needs to serve as an example for Melchior, and if she fires off a big one, it'll just set a bad standard for him. And when it's finally the day of, the apprentices attend merely for observation. This is so they know their expected roles during the ceremonies. As Rosemine enters the chapel, she sees Thule right away, and she's looking as beautiful as ever with her hair tied up completely. Good for her. Even her hairpin is basically an updated version of the one she wore during her baptism. So honestly, this has Rosemine feeling pretty nostalgic already. To distract herself, she goes into the ceremony and uses a face stone to give a normal-sized blessing. Good, it all worked out. That is until she notices Gunther and Effa in the doorway wearing their charms, basically declaring their intention to follow her to the sovereignty. Okay, she can't hold it anymore. A huge blessing fires out at that sight. Thule looks back with a sharp glare, but she tries to brush it off as a demonstration for the apprentices. Not that anyone would buy that. So, Thule's officially an adult. Wow, talk about sentimental, right? In the first book, Thule hadn't even been baptized yet, and now we're seeing her as an adult. Really puts into perspective just how far we've come. As we know, fall is a pretty busy season, and after the baptisms and multiple trips to supply mana for Groshel's upcoming Entwickeln, the apprentice Blue Robes are preparing for the Harvest Festival. Rosemine did her best to ensure they aren't going to be bullied on their trips from the scholars attending with them, but there's really not much she can do once they're out of sight. Melchior asks if Felina is going to participate as well, but she won't, mostly due to her not having the personnel to go. And she also doesn't need the funds over winter like everyone else does. But as their meeting wraps up, an ordinance arrives from Sylvester to schedule a visit for the interviews with the orphans. This is more of a formality than an actual interview, since Hartmut's already vetted him, but she encourages Lorenz to go speak with Bertram. The kid is due to be baptized this winter, and he had his own magic tool, so he didn't need an interview with Hartmut to get one. And while his grades and mana pass Sylvester's standards, his attitude is actually the biggest mystery. Yeah, he's obedient for Wilma, but will that keep up? Is he willing to serve the archducal family? She wants Lorenz to ensure that he knows what's ahead of him. Dirk's another case for concern though. He didn't start taking Harspiel seriously until he decided to be a noble. Yeah, the kid's already gonna have it rough. Basically, he's in a similar position to Rosemine with her common sense, but he does lack the adult mindset that's let her reason through most of this crap. Noble life might not be too kind to him, so she asks Damiel and Felina to go help him out a bit. When Sylvester arrives, his Archduke persona is in full swing for a quick chat before the interviews. He tells her he only cares if these orphans can be of use to him, so he won't let her get sentimental and she actually understands her place. She won't argue. The simple fact that he's giving them this chance is enough. That drains the tension, since Sylvester was worried that she'd throw a fit. In the orphanage, Dirk and Bertram are lined up where he basically says what the reports he received told him. Dirk needs to practice the Harspiel more, but Bertram has no areas to improve on. He's good enough, so it confirms Dirk's intention for himself, reminding him that he'll be viewed as a criminal and he'll have to swear his name. But here is where a noble and a great priest have wildly differing opinions. Dirk is actually happy he gets to pick whom he serves, unlike as a Grey Robe, where that decision would have been made for him, and who knows the sort of person who would buy him. Sylvester finds that pretty sad, but at least he's got the right mindset. Bertram, however, has something he wants to say. Is it about swearing his name? No. He's actually pissed that Dirk, a mere orphan, gets to be a noble. But Sylvester swiftly reminds him that he's an orphan too. His family was executed for treason, and the life this kid knew is gone forever. Even if he becomes a noble now, it won't be like going home. He'll become an apprentice Blue Robe like the other baptized children. So he's still gonna be in the temple even after he's baptized. Sylvester asks him straight up, can he serve the people who executed his family? And does he really understand his position? And Bertram does. Lorenz told him all about it, but rather than Rosemine, he wants to swear his name to Melchior, since he actually spends the most time with them in the orphanage. He's grown kind of attached. And that's what matters, is that he's considered it in the first place. Dirk and Bertram have both passed their interviews and are going to be baptized this winter. This has been on the back burner for a while now, but what's the point of this? It's more to show the consequences for Rosemine's actions while also giving us a bit of lore for the next volume. Dirk is, in a lot of ways, a parallel to Rosemine, so we learn about her peculiar situation through him, both in the similarities and differences. Okay, now that those are over, they can actually talk about Groshel's renovation. They've got a plan for the mana, but when is it going to be best to actually do it? Yeah, Rosemine's going to be gone for the Harvest Festival, but also Florencia is due to give birth soon, so it's after that is when they're going to do the Entwickeln, with Florencia choosing to chug rejuvenation potions to help with the process. That's worrying, but what about the cleanup? Like with the lower city, they're going to need a massive wash-in to scrub the city clean. And without Ferdinand there to brute force it with magic circles and mana. I mean, Clarissa did research large-scale magic tools. Could she go? That's probably a bad idea. It would appear that someone outside of their duchy is helping, not Sylvester. Besides, the Archducal family needs to take charge, and Clarissa is leaving with Rosemine. No, to send a message, the entire Archducal family's archnoble retainers will go. They're going to be the ones to power the wash-in. But as they send word about this to everyone, Sylvester gets an ordinance from Liebrecht stating Florencia has gone into labor. Melchior is going back with him because family members can offer mana during the process to help out, but Rosemine can't. She's not blood related. So Sylvester asks her to pray for a safe birth instead, and she does just that. Days later, she receives word that Florencia has given birth to a healthy baby girl, and another week after that, she's called up to the castle for the Entwickeln. Remember how Groshel's renovations have been a hot topic for the past few books? Yeah, it got taken care of in a paragraph. Why is that? Because it's not in the main city, so it's not like Rosemine went to see it like the lower city. But that also basically wraps up all of her noble business before her big move. So what's left? She needs to finish up the Harvest Festival and talk to her Gutenbergs about their plans. With that, we get an update on how things went in Groschel. The Guy was pretty happy with the Archducal family's support in their cleaning, while the merchants moving into the city were at the ready, but also the ones passing through heading back to their home duchies were also pretty interested. Yeah, they're expecting word to spread about their increased trade slots next year. As for the Harvest Festival, Hartmut will handle the Weisgang provinces that Wilfried did during Spring Prayer. She'll visit Kernberger and also hand over the monastery's foundation to Melchior, so he can be the one to supply it as the next High Bishop. When she goes to leave, Melchior comments on how convenient her High Beast really is, and he wants one for himself. But according to Charlotte, the mana requirements to change its size are massive, and unfortunately, since Ferdinand left, they haven't been able to meet the requirements to teach anyone else her mana compression method. That sucks, but she's planning to publicize the contents of the Underground Archive when she's a royal, which contains information about mana compression. Hell, apparently even Georgine has come up with a multi-step method, so it's likely that Melchior could come up with one himself, with the right inspiration. After the monastery's handover, she heads over to Kernberger, where she picks up the Gutenbergs and drops them off in Ehrenfest. Things went pretty smoothly on their end, which is great, probably due to Judith's hard work preparing her province. But she drops the news that she needs all the Gutenbergs and their foremen to participate in a meeting at the temple, minus Heidi, because she would just cause problems. Dodge that bullet. And when it's time for that meeting, she drops the bombshell that she'll be moving after the next Archduke conference, and she wants either her Gutenbergs or their disciples to come with her. That's pretty rare to be given a choice, but Lutz asks if this is set in stone. And it pretty much is. The Gilberta Company and Effa are going to be leaving right away, but the rest of her associates have 3 years until they come of age, though Benno's planning to go after that first year to prepare workshops, which really just means that Lutz will have to convince his parents to let him go before he comes of age, so that opens it up. Who's moving? Ingo declines because, well, he's the foreman of his own successful workshop already. He worked pretty hard for that, and because of her, his business is booming. Thus, he proposes sending his disciple instead. Zach wants to go, so he'll be asking her to step in and cancel his contract, which she's willing to do, but he needs to speak to his new wife first. Make sure she's fine with going. Josef looks at Bierce, where they already see what Heidi will want to do, so this is more about sorting out their affairs since Josef is his successor. Though as it turns out, Bierce has another daughter, and Josef tells Horace to get his Beruf certification so he can inherit the workshop instead by marrying her. That just leaves one. What about Johann? Yeah, he can't leave. He's supposed to be marrying his foreman's granddaughter. They'll have to sort that out then. Or not, because it doesn't really take him too long. The next day, we find out she actually wanted to marry Danilo instead, because he's that much more sociable. Thus, Johann is going with Rosemine, and the foreman sends him off with a smile. Dude didn't really have much work besides Rosemine, so it won't hurt their workshop that much. Devastating. Okay, so this just leaves a few more. Gil clearly wants to say something, so she cuts him off and says she wants him to move in 3 years' time too. Wilma's gonna stay with Elvira until then, and then her and Nicola will move with Felina. So that sorts out her personnel. But Charlotte arrives as the last one to finish up the Harvest Festival and makes a pretty odd request. She's pretty much the only one gunning for the seat of Ob at this point, so she's all but guaranteed the position. Yet she's asking for an engraving with Rosemine's crest as well? Why's that? This isn't to say she's looking to move or under Rosemine's protection, but more as a show of resolve. It's to say that they'll always be sisters. And Rosemine happily places an order with Johann to make a medallion, one that has her crest on it for Charlotte to keep as a memento. Wow, things really flew by at the end of this book, but the Gutenbergs have all made their choices. With Groschel finally taken care of, she's wrapped up all of her business in Ehrenfest. All that's left is her last year in the Royal Academy as an Ehrenfest Archduke candidate. The epilogue picks up from Lutz's perspective. He's back at the planting company with Benno where things are feeling pretty nostalgic. Benno informs him of the only additional thing he knows, that they're heading to the Sovereignty, but he tells Lutz to get his business sorted with his family so they don't have another falling out like right after his baptism. That feels like yesterday to Mark and Benno, but to Lutz in the audience, that was over 20 books ago. Goddamn. How time flies. But as usual, they're expecting this to spiral out of control and tell him to be ready to move within a year. Who's gonna take over the planting company in Ehrenfest? Benno's little sister Milda. Yeah, Karina might be the baby of the family, but way back in part 1, Benno mentioned that he had some other family set up a shop outside of Ehrenfest for paper. This is her. She moved back in over summer to take over his store in Ehrenfest. But Lutz needs to focus on himself and see if his family is gonna come with them. Also, swing by and see his new fiancée Tuli, since they haven't seen each other since their engagement was decided before he left. Wait, what? Yeah, Lutz and Tuli got engaged due to their family circumstances, because they both know about Rosemine's secrets. So he swings by and picks up Tuli at the Gilberta company, where they both get teased. But Lutz is more blown away by seeing her with her hair up and wearing a long dress. Like, absolutely stunned. That makes her pretty embarrassed, since she's used to it by now. But we see they're definitely interested in one another. It's not just a marriage of convenience. But as they chat about the upcoming move, she tells him to relax. All this talk about the past with Benno got him nervous that his family was gonna make him stay. But turns out that Gunther pretty much took care of it already. Since they're going and Lutz is marrying Tuli, he's practically family already. Well, not practically. They actually are, since neighborhoods tend to be closely related. Yeah, it's confirmed in this that Lutz and Mine's families are actually distant cousins. But as they talk, Lutz gives her a gift. Some pictures of flowers for inspiration on designs, since these don't grow around the city. But he also has some stories he wants to turn into a book for Rosemine, and Tuli likes those too. He was gonna organize those this winter into a book, but that might turn into a job for after the move. And thus, she sends him off to go talk to his family and secure their blessing. He races home and picks up some food along the way for them to eat, since they probably aren't expecting him home anyway. And his mom is in a bit of a mood. She's happy to see him, of course, but she still treats him like she always has. As soon as they're inside, she makes him help with dinner, which he's not really used to anymore. Yeah, dude's been living the rich life for so long, he's used to having servants do it for him. As he starts to tell her about this move, she cuts him off, saying that he's already made up his mind, and he has. He wants to go, and with Gunther's family going too, she's not too worried. Lutz barely comes home as it is, and he's out of the city for half the year anyway. So as far as she's concerned, he left a long time ago, and his father's in agreement. Since he's engaged already, Carla's job as a parent is basically done, because in the lower city, marriage is when a parent considers their work finally finished. So with that, Lutz has his parents' blessing to go. Well, this volume felt like a bit of a lull in the story, but packed a lot of emotional heart. Aside from the tearjerker with Elvira, there were a lot of powerful moments this book, with Tuli's coming of age, Felina and Daniel's resolve, and even the reveal about Lutz's engagement. But we still have side stories to get through, and they continue the trend of setting up the conflict for the coming volumes. First up is the Lanzanov envoys from Detlin's perspective. She's doing paperwork, which she hates, but once she obtains the Gurtrasite, she won't have to worry about that anymore. I mean, not that she can look currently. Her interactions with the royals have been a pain, between Magdalena taunting her and Trauerqual ordering Ferdinand to get a hidden room by the funeral. Surely Jürgen Schmidt is gonna fall into ruin with them at the helm. But while she's being pissy, she suddenly gets goosebumps across her arm. That unpleasant response is what happens when someone with sufficient mana enters a duchy without permission, which is pretty similar to what happened with Rosemine in the monastery when it was attacked by commoners. but because her father died, they're without Nob currently, and thus cannot close their border gates. So while she abandons her work to go see what's up, the scholars with her mention letting Ferdinand know. That's annoying, but she's too stoked to see their guests to care. After changing into her riding clothes, Detlind races off to the border gate, which is in the middle of the ocean. That's when she sees a pretty interesting sight. Ferdinand is already there, and he confirms if it's a Lanzanov ship or not. Turns out, this is a newer design. It's black as it crosses the country gate, but once it's inside, it shifts to silver. Why does it do that? She doesn't know, but the envoys insist on doing that if they're gonna stay in Jürgenschmidt. Weird. Surely that's not connected to the silver cloth. Well, now that they know who it is, Ferdinand wants to station knights to guard the gate, but Detlind thinks that's pointless. It's a country gate that only Lanzanov can use. So, who the hell would attack them through it? But for some reason, the knights all listen to him over her. That's frustrating as hell. Then he leaves the welcoming feast to her? That's insulting on top of annoying. Doesn't he know his place? She should be the one issuing orders. The welcoming feast itself is on the smaller side, since a larger one is held during the Starbind when the Geebs gather to socialize with the envoys. Ferdinand makes it clear that he's not with them by wearing Ehrenfest colors rather than blue for summer. But when the Lanzanov group enters, turns out, they're all wearing silver again. Must mean they're envoys or something, right? Detlind doesn't know or care. There's 12 in total, with half looking like anybody else from Jürgenschmidt, while the other half have darker skin with different features. But one man steps forward as their representative, and seems like he's a bit older than Detlind. He kneels and introduces himself as Leonzio, grandson to Lanzanov's previous king, Chiafredo, and he gives the standard spring greeting with a blessing. Yes, he has an Omni-Elemental face stone on his ring, meaning he's a royal. But when he looks at Ferdinand, he's absolutely shocked for a brief moment before putting on a noble smile. Not that Ferdinand had any reaction to him, but they move on to socializing where Ferdinand sticks to Detlind like glue to keep her from embarrassing herself. Or rather, make sure Lanzanov doesn't push any demands. And sure enough, they try. By appealing to Detlind for a princess to be sent to Edelgisa, he asks if the king of Jürgenschmidt wishes to bring Lanzanov to ruin. But why would that be the case? Detlind wants to hear their story so she can pass it along to the king, as though he's not aware. But Ferdinand doesn't back down and supports the king's decision. It was denied for a reason, and they need to learn their place. That annoys Detlind some more, so she tries to set up a meeting between Lanzanov and the king to sort it out. But that's outrageous. She then shuts Ferdinand down by saying she'll hear them out as well, so he shouldn't try to interfere. She calls Ferdinand a Weegalebe, assuming he's just being jealous, and then leaves for another room with Leonzio for a private chat. Here, we get a rundown on the whole Lanzanov situation. Yeah, it started about 400 years ago when a king was gonna die, and of his sons, 3 had actually obtained Grutrosites. Wait, there's more than one? Detlind thought that whoever had it became Zent automatically, but apparently not, because Leonzio says that the Grutrosite can be duplicated with a Stab, so it's not that unusual, right? However, one of the sons not chosen decides to fuck right off with his family, all their retainers, magic tools, and face stones right on out of Arnsbach's country gate, since he wasn't chosen. That's when they came to Lanzanov, a country of people who were unable to use magic. The land wasn't great, but it could still grow food, and that was good enough for them. Using the copy of the Grutrosite he had, he created a foundation and made an ivory city right there, and thus he became their god king as a result. But there were some big flaws with this whole making his own country plan. They couldn't have kids with the natives due to their mana differences, and turns out, Stabs can only be obtained in Jürgenschmidt. Since his Grutrosite for running Lanzanov was a copy, it needed to be passed down to another Stab. Hell, the foundation can only be maintained by those with Stabs. But since the entire noble population of Lanzanov are the descendants of royals and their retainers, mana isn't exactly an issue. They have the same education as the Royal Academy. Thus, they formed an agreement with Jürgenschmidt that they would send princesses to have children born in Jürgenschmidt to be sent back to Lanzanov to rule, as one had to be a citizen of Jürgenschmidt to obtain a Stab. That's why baptisms are so important. But now that they've refused, Lanzanov is facing a succession crisis themselves. But when Detlind informs Ferdinand, he just blows her off. Why? Because who the hell cares about Lanzanov? The native population there was surviving without nobles before they decided to build their city, so it crumbling won't destroy the country. As for introducing new possible royals into the country here, yeah, that's a pretty bad idea. But they're in the same boat, right? They don't have a Grutricide either, but Ferdinand suspects that won't be the case for much longer. Lind assumes that he's referring to her, so yeah, they've reached an impasse. But the fact that Lind wants to take a Lanzanov princess without knowing what that all entails is unsettling, especially when she cuts Ferdinand off as he tries to explain it. So Lind yells at him, which finally makes his mask slip, and she gets a glimpse of who Ferdinand really is. And yeah, she doesn't like his cold attitude. From then on, she starts racing off to the Lanzanov estate frequently, and Leonzio flirts with her pretty damn hard. But too bad for her, this is clearly just a ruse to get her to open up. And it works, because she says that she's a Zent candidate and cannot accept Leonzio's feelings. Oh, does that mean that she has a Grutricide then? Well, no, and neither does the royal family. She wants to end her engagement to Ferdinand, and Leonzio offers to help her along the path to get a Grutricide, because he just so happens to know how to obtain one, apparently. Plus, he doesn't have a Stab, so it's not like he can become king himself. Wouldn't you trust him? And thus, he proposes to her on the spot. Now, Lind's clearly not thinking with her head, as there's a sweet smell in the air, and everything feels like a dream. Suddenly, she notices that she can actually sense Leonzio's mana, meaning he's a good fit for her. Her retainers actually try to stop her, but she orders them not to interfere, as she takes his hand. Next is my hopes and their problems from Lisalette's perspective. After Lisaletta turned Rosemind down about joining her in the sovereignty, Elvira invites her over before the family meeting to discuss these events. Now she's with her fiancé at the time since she had time off, but he's fine with her leaving should she talk to Bonifacius about something they discussed previously. That sounds shady. And it is. Because Lisaletta is annoyed that he's using her to get close to Bonifacius when really it's her sister who's closest to him. Besides, Thorsten wants her to ask for leniency on his family who's being punished in the Purge, which is beyond her med noble status to do, and they're not even married yet. Yeah, she's not looking forward to this marriage if this is how it's gonna start. So she meets with Elvira at her estate and she wastes no time. She says she'll be overseeing Rosemind's move due to Florencia's pregnancy, and she wants Lisaletta to go since her only attendant would be Gresha, who served her for not even a whole season at this point. Has Rosemind failed her as a lady? Well, no. But she repeats her same excuse, and Elvira refuses to accept it. She could easily have that Starbind moved up, and they could both move with Rosemind. But Thorsten, her fiancé, is a former Veronica faction noble through and through. Lisaletta flat out says she doesn't love him, and it would be best for her house if their engagement was cancelled. But they're simply med nobles, and Thorsten is actually marrying down in status her march noble to get his agenda pushed through. Elvira then phrases it this way: would she go to the sovereignty if she could? And Lisaletta says absolutely, though she's not confident due to her status. She would need someone of sufficiently high enough status to order her to go. And hey, Elvira could actually make that happen. We get some circumstances here about Lisaletta, that she increased her mana so much for Rosemind's sake, took the scholar courses on being a doctor so she could monitor her lady's health without telling anyone, but most importantly, she's the one who would make Rosemind's move the most comfortable. Rosemind and Elvira value Lisaletta's skills and presence. Thus, that spurred the events we saw in the meeting. Yeah, it wasn't sprung up out of nowhere. But later on, Elvira calls her parents over to solidify this chat. She swears them to secrecy and explains that they want Lisaletta to go to the sovereignty with Angelica to serve Rosemind. So will they refuse? Well, no. Because despite Lisaletta being the successor, her mana capacity has pretty much outgrown their house at this point, and that would make her job as the head of house pretty difficult. Yeah, a house head is meant to mediate marriages and consult family members. They're proud of the progress she made, so they actually want her to go. Now originally they would have played the long game and chosen to raise their house's rank after a few generations with the mana compression method that Rosemind gave them, but that's out the window now that Rosemind's going. Thus they'll have Lisaletta's original partner inherit the house instead, since he was raised to support her in that role in the first place. And too bad she outpaced him in mana. This Thorsten business has been a pain in their ass for far too long, and in exchange for Elvira getting them to end it to not reflect poorly on Lisaletta's house, she'll have to step up as Rosemind's head attendant. Wait, what? A mere med noble as a head attendant for a princess? Well, think about it. Lisaletta has the mana to be an arch noble, so really she just needs to secure a proper marriage to get that status in the first place. And once she's in the sovereignty, she can probably do that pretty easily. In the meantime though, she'll have to learn to socialize as an arch noble from Brunhilde and Notilli. And with that, that's how Lisaletta was able to go. And lastly, we have an inquiry into the commotion from Sylvester's perspective. He's in his guest room in Arnsbach after the funeral complaining about the heat to Karstedt. I mean, he shouldn't be hot though. since Ferdinand gave them a magic circle ahead of time that regulates the heat in clothing. But because of all of Sylvester's divine protections, he kept overcharging it when his concentration slipped and he was practically freezing to death. But this is all just to kill time until he's summoned for the inquiry into the events that happened during the funeral with the knights. He asks Karstedt again what he saw, and he doesn't really know. Some knights stood up and rushed at Lind, but that was it. Weird. So that's when Sylvester goes to the inquiry, and it's Sigiswald, Ferdinand, and Georgine there. Wait, why isn't Dat Lind there representing Arnsbach as the next Aub? Well, probably to avoid a blunder, but that does send a bad message for Ferdinand as her fiancé. So they ask Sylvester what he saw, and he says not much. Some knights got rowdy all of a sudden, and the Sovereign Knights Order got them under control. But is that all he has to say about it? Turns out the knights who acted were all from Ehrenfest originally. Yeah, Sylvester doesn't care much. The Duchy's bests all fled when Veronica came to power because they disliked her methods and never looked back. He explains that the only nobles to move to the sovereignty in his time as Aub have been scholars, so he didn't even know that Ehrenfest had knights in the Sovereign Knights Order. I mean, it's not like they contact them anyway. Georgine tries to antagonize Sylvester over that, but he's not too concerned. Sigiswald then asks how he feels about his duchy citizens causing issues, but he claps back that Ehrenfest isn't related in this matter. Yeah, they may come from Ehrenfest, but Georgine would be much more familiar with them since they would have been from around her generation or older. So he asks if she knew them, or perhaps met them in her time as the first wife of Arnsbach, but she calls that accusation unfounded. Sylvester says she has a history of keeping in touch with nobles from other duchies though. Yeah, hinting about the name sworn there, but she simply claims that's because they want to be connected to a greater duchy like Arnsbach. Obviously, Sigiswald is playing both sides of this debate, looking to pretty much just blame Ehrenfest and call it there, probably because he's salty over Rosemind's bullying, but Sylvester seriously just wants to smack this dude upside the head, because he knows that Anastasius warned him about Arnsbach and Trug, but he's still not done brushing off their blame. There seems to be a pattern here of the Sovereign Knights Order losing control of their knights lately, so why is this not their fault? But Raublut says that the knights last time got off easy by just being sent home, and this time they were just flat out executed. Wow, already? Didn't they think to question them first? Probably, but Raublut is sussy as hell. He tries to pin the blame on Ferdinand for having Det Lind order their executions right away. Okay, so this seems pretty weird. Everyone on every side of this seems to be associated with Ehrenfest. But finally, Sylvester puts his foot down and says that they've bent over backwards for the royal family. Why are they under so much suspicion? Sigiswald backs off at that point, but Sylvester looks right at Georgine. Was this a plot to prevent him from meeting the Sovereign Knights this winter? Who knows, but probably. The meeting ends without much really coming out of it, but as Sylvester notices Georgine's smile, he has a gut feeling that it won't be much longer before things are settled once and for all. So we've made it through the side stories that are setting the stage for the final act of this series. But before we can get lost on that rabbit hole, and trust me, it is one, we've got to wrap this video up with my final thoughts. This volume really covered a ton in terms of time, but really captured the whirlwind of Rosemind's last year in Ehrenfest. She had so much to do. Balancing her temple handover work, Groshel's renovations, sorting out her retainers and personnel, Ferdinand's request, and then clearing up the political mess her adoption caused, all while hearing these massive reveals about who knows what about her past. This book was a lot less plot and more emotional payoff for the story we've had thus far, which after these past few volumes, we've desperately needed. And I think one of the biggest things we found out this volume is the few nobles who knew about Rosemind's origins outside Karstedt, Ferdinand, and Sylvester. If we recall way back at the end of part 2, Karstedt only told Elvira that Rosemind was the commoner shrine maiden rumors were flying about in the temple, and that she was going to be baptized as his daughter that summer. However, she took it upon herself to put the pieces together about Rosemind's family and the importance of her time in the temple. She did actually let Rosemind spend that much time there despite being a noble, so she understood the reason why. Now juxtapose this to Florencia, who we did get an insight into this volume. She still believes that Rosemind was simply just raised in the temple, and that Elvira visits her there frequently. Now this isn't because Florencia is stupid or anything like that, but because she didn't spend that much time with Rosemind outside of an official capacity. Not for lack of trying, mind you. Yeah, they do have a good relationship, but nothing like Elvira and Rosemind, even before their little heart-to-heart this volume, as Elvira has always been her role model for a proper noblewoman since she entered noble society in the first place. But big surprise here, Hartmut actually managed to piece this all together himself. because their conspiracy was simply too big in the first place. Kinda saw that coming. Yeah, this was mentioned all the way back in part 2 as well, but if you tell a Grey Robe what the truth is, they'll accept it without question, especially if it's from a noble. Now, it wasn't that they didn't believe Rosemine's backstory and told Hartmut, but that the story's been changing since its inception, to the point that even Rosemine mentions at various points in this series that they've added to her legend in the orphanage. And you do notice, as soon as Hartmut was in the temple, he was talking to the Grey Robes directly, and even bragged about uncovering new aspects of her saint legend around every corner. That's why he visited the orphanage so much, even before becoming the High Priest. The thing was, he was putting all those inconsistencies together, and noticed who she put her faith in the first place. This all pointed to her being a commoner turned noble, and even who her family was. But Hartmut was so into the whole Rosemine thing by that point, since her actual baptism actually, he just doesn't care. Why? Because the short stories collection actually shows us just how utterly bored Hartmut is with Ehrenfest. If not for her, he most likely would have joined the Sovereignty to escape their mundane politics. But she's the one who broadened his horizons, so he's obsessed with her because of that. The fact that she's a commoner only makes her more of a saint in his eyes. So of all the people to figure out her origins, Hartmut was probably the most predictable reaction, but one I wanted to see the most. I mentioned this last volume, but throughout this part, we're seeing Rosemine get a much stronger connection to her noble family than we've ever seen before. Now, is that too late into the story? No, not really. Rather, nobles do actually have close familial bonds, but Rosemine has missed out on that due to a few reasons. Mostly she was consistently doing something and just staying in the temple. Elvira flat out wished that she had made a hidden room with Rosemine when she first came to the estate, and essentially shows her this volume how nobles express close relationships. But because Ferdinand kept her mentally stable most of the time, Elvira never had the chance to do this before. Also, Elvira isn't stupid. She realized Rosemine just lost her lower city family and wasn't eager to try and replace them so soon, as that would have probably come off as insensitive and pushed Rosemine away from her further. But now that Ferdinand isn't in the picture, others are able to actually step up and connect with her like they should have before. Was Ferdinand preventing that? Yeah, but not intentionally. He's a horribly scarred individual whose only outlet for his emotions was his research. Bro never really had a chance to get close to his family, what little family he had in the first place, so he just did what was natural for him with Rosemine. That's why part 5 sees her building that father-daughter relationship with Sylvester, that strong sister bond with Charlotte and Melchior, and connecting with Elvira as a mother and daughter should've. And it's coming at this point in the story for a reason. This parallels the shift between part 2 and 3, where just as her status increases again, she's losing the family she built in Ehrenfest. But what's gonna be different this time around? Well, Rosemine has more power, so she can actually fight her way through it. The side stories really packed some of the juiciest information in this volume in terms of plot. You've noticed, we've been getting a lot of hints about character motives and connections these past few books. This volume in particular is setting up the endgame. As last volume we learned who the big players were, and now we're seeing their interests align and how they come to work together. Raublut, Georgine, and Lonzanov all share a connection through Trug. The signature sweet smell and dreamlike effect of which was mentioned directly by Det Lind when Leonzio was seducing her, so that solidifies the last major player in this series, Lonzanov's royal family, and how Raublut and Georgine tag team Sylvester in his side story firmly roots that these two are working together besides supplying drugs. Even Sylvester saw it, but killing those knights was a direct message to Ehrenfest. But the looming question is, what is the ultimate goal and motivation? We're still a book or two away from those, but we're seeing the pieces finally falling into place. We know Raublut is connected to Adalgisa, he holds some grudge against Ferdinand, a former seat of Adalgisa, and that seems to align with Georgine's interest against Ehrenfest. So, where does Lonzanov come in? Leonzio told us about their situation, and how desperate they are to get a princess accepted into the Adalgisa villa, so that way they can get a new Stab-wielding member of their royal family. Yeah, this all seems to come back to Adalgisa in some way, so we'll find out the full implications of that in the coming books, and where this franchise is headed. And lastly, there's a pretty interesting detail I do want to draw attention to. Ferdinand mentioned offhandedly to Det Lind that it wouldn't be too long before someone obtains the Grutrasite, and I really wanted to draw attention to this point. Now I won't spoil exactly what that means, but there are a lot of pieces on the table that click into place once the reveal is made over the next few volumes about Ferdinand's past, what he knows, and what his goal is. But the thing to keep in mind is what big task he gave Rosemine last volume. while telling her to wait a whole year. The Lord of Evil is cooking up something massive, and the payoff for it will be integral to the climax of this story. So that's it. This volume was less about actual plot and more about emotional closure, showing Rosemine preparing to leave Ehrenfest so she can go to the sovereignty without regrets. And in the process, it gave us a lot of great moments that make this volume powerful. But what's on the horizon? Monzanov is plotting with Detlin to get her a Gruchicite, Georgine is targeting Ehrenfest, and in the midst of that, Rosemine is supposed to move to the sovereignty and get one for herself. The next volume is Rosemine's 4th year in the academy, and if you thought her last one was crazy, this one will leave you flabbergasted. For now though, hey, you've made it to the end of the video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, and do all the other YouTube stuff to help the channel grow. You can also join my Discord with the link down in the description. And if you really want to support me, you can head on over to my Patreon and pick up some extra perks. And speaking of Patreon, I'd like to give a special thanks to Ariel Autumn, JMon33A, Pokeflute, Robin DBL, Samuel Chen, Tristan, and Vonstrom for their continued support. Thanks for watching.